I will not say much because we don't need any more words here. We all know what's happening. We all know what it's all about. We know it in our heads. We feel it in our hearts. You don't need any more facts. I'll just mention a couple of things. One is I was interviewed in this building 4 weeks ago. The CBC is doing a documentary on a Swiss diplomat who, in 1944, in Hungary, where I was born, went to a lot of trouble and at the risk of his own personal safety to save Jews from the Nazi murders, the genocide. And in that interview, which is going to air on the CBC sometime in the next few weeks, I said something that I'm pretty sure will not show up in the film. And I said that if there's a message to be learned, it's that we can't be silent in the face of injustice. And I'm afraid that these days, it's my own people that are imposing the injustice on another people. And sometime, maybe they'll do documentaries on the very few Israelis that are standing up on behalf of the Palestinians. My guess is that that part of the interview will not show up on the CBC National News. My guess is that they're going to cut that out for the same reasons that the media in this country still has only one side of the narrative burnt in their minds. And that side of the narrative is that at the very best, there's some kind of a conflict going on. So when the newspapers write about it, they talk about the Palestine-Israeli conflict. Well, I'm not trying to make comparisons because the two issues are different, but nobody ever writes about the Jewish-Nazi conflict. There wasn't a conflict. There was a one-sided oppression and murder. I'm not comparing the two events, but there's no conflict here either. What there is occupation and dispossession and mass killings and mass torture and mass jailings and the deprivation of lands, the denial of water rights, the destruction of health, the blockade of civilians in a large outdoor prison. That's what you have on the one side by an army which is equipped by the latest equipment, laser-guided drones, airplanes, helicopters, tanks, armored vehicles, every sophisticated weapon in the world. And on the other side, mostly unarmed civilians behind a fence. And this is what they call a conflict. This is what they call clashes between the two sides. These aren't clashes. That's not what they are. The other thing I want to say is that I look around in Israel last week, there was a demonstration in Tel Aviv against the killings that occurred last week. 250 people showed up. In a country of 6 or 7 million, 250 people showed up. In 1982, whenever the Sabra Shatila massacres happened, there was a demonstration that drew over 100,000 people. Now it's 250. Which means that that country is hardening. It's becoming tighter and tighter and tighter and less open. And the very few people there who are still courageous enough to speak out face grave repercussions, and the journalist Gideon Levy, who writes about this, who called the Israeli army last week an army of massacre, he has to walk around with a bodyguard. So there's a hardening that's happened. And of course it has to happen, because if you're going to oppress people, you're going to have to make yourself harder and harder and harder all the time. We just finished the Jewish holiday of Passover, where Pharaoh's heart was hardened. It had to be so that he could be punished. Well, the hardening that's happening right now, it's going to create a lot more suffering for the Palestinians. It's also going to create suffering for the Israelis, not on the same scale. Not yet. But in the long term, the harder you become, the more brittle you become. And the more brittle you become, the more sure it is that you're going to break apart. And so that country and that regime and that system is actually digging its own grave. I'm not at all optimistic in the short term. In the short term, there's very little hope. There's very little ground for optimism. The two-state solution is almost virtually impossible anymore. And the world is not at the point yet where it's willing to put pressure on Israel strong enough to force it to give it up. But it's going to happen because it can't last. This kind of evil, this kind of travesty against truth cannot happen, cannot persist, cannot survive, and it will not. And until then, it doesn't matter how many of us show up for these protests. It doesn't matter if it's 1 or 5 or 50 or 100 or 500. What is important that we keep showing up, we keep speaking the truth. Hannah called me a supporter of Palestinian rights. Well, yeah, that's true, but it's not like I'm against Israeli rights either. It's just that I'm in favor of the truth. And the truth does not know any nationality. So if I support Palestinian rights right now, it's because the truth demands that. And because that system there is so based on opposition to the truth, it cannot survive. It will not survive. And until then, let's just keep showing up. And let's keep the BDS, let's whatever we can do to put pressure. The Israelis who are working for the truth, the very few of them, they're calling upon us. They're desperate for outside help because they know that within their own country, they're powerless right now. So that whatever we can do from the outside, that's what they want us to do. So it's not a question of being for Palestine against the Israelis. It's a question of being in favor of the truth. Thank you.